These 6 true small-town horror stories are inspired by real events. Here's just a preview of the tales you're about to hear. First, a family discovers the knocking in their walls is an intelligent entity that will spend the next 2 years trying to tear them apart from the inside. Next, a man investigating a disappearance uncovers a dark, decades-old pattern connecting strange lights in the sky to a shadowy figure that walks the woods. And finally, a family's farmhouse is surrounded for one terrifying night by a silent army of creatures that shouldn't exist. Listen until the very end, because you're going to hear the first-hand account of the moment one of those things stops watching from the fields and punches a hole straight through the ceiling to get to the family inside. A tired police officer, a man named Noor, stood in a narrow hallway and just stared. His face, which had been bored and annoyed a minute before, was now a pale, blank mask. He wasn't looking at Jacqueline, the woman who'd called him out to this little council house on what felt like a wild goose chase. He was looking at a simple wooden chair by the front door. A moment ago, it had been flush against the wall, a place for mail and forgotten keys. Now it sat a few feet out in the open. It had slid there on its own, a slow, deliberate crawl across the linoleum floor that made no sound at all. He'd seen it with his own eyes. There were no strings, no tricks, just the impossible reality of it. The air in the hall was thick and still. He didn't say a word, didn't try to explain it away as a draft or a vibration from the road. He just turned, the leather of his belt creaking in the silence, walked out the front door, and got on his radio. For Jacqueline and her 4 kids, it was a moment of pure, cold terror. But it was also something else. A relief. It was proof. They weren't crazy. The thing in their house was real, and now someone else had seen it. Before all this, life was just life. Jacqueline was a single mom, working a job that paid just enough to keep the lights on, and this little house north of London was the best she could manage. It was cramped, sure, the walls thin enough to hear everything. But it was a home. It was full of the usual racket of a family packed in tight. The clink of forks and knives at dinner, the low mumble of the television in the corner, and the constant high-pitched squabbling of her 2 girls, Helen and Emma, over some doll or a bit of space on the rug. It was a normal house, filled with the normal sounds of a life being lived. It was safe, until it wasn't. It started so small you could almost miss it. A knock, a single solid rap on the living room wall, sharp as a knuckle on a coffin lid. Jacqueline figured it was the neighbors, maybe a kid kicking a ball. Then a second knock answered it, this time from the floor right under her feet. A hard, decisive thud. It was a strange little thing, a call and response, like the house was talking to itself. She tried to ignore it. Soon, ignoring it wasn't an option. The knocking was everywhere. It followed them from room to room with a weird kind of intelligence. It would start with a polite tap, tap, tap in the girls' bedroom while they were trying to do their homework. Then, as soon as they'd moved to the kitchen for a snack, a loud, echoing bang would answer from the very room they'd just left. It got faster, angrier. The sound changed from a simple knock to a heavy, insistent pounding, like someone with a sledgehammer was trying to break in from the inside. The kids were getting spooked. 10-year-old Helen, a quiet girl, was the first to experience something more. She ran from her room one night, white as a sheet, her breathing ragged. She swore her bed had started shaking. Not a gentle tremble, but a violent, back-and-forth jerking while she was reading. Jacqueline held her tight and tried to calm her, told her it was a bad dream, but she didn't believe it herself. She'd felt the house shake too. Something was wrong in this house. something was getting stronger. Then came the day the furniture moved. Jacqueline was in the kitchen, washing up, the radio playing softly. She heard it over the sound of the running water, a deep, groaning scrape from the living room. It was an ugly sound, the grinding protest of heavy wood being dragged across linoleum. She dried her hands and walked in, expecting to see one of the kids pushing something. She just stopped cold. The big chest of drawers, a solid piece of oak that took 2 men to move in, was sitting in the middle of the room. It had been against the far wall just moments before. The wallpaper behind it was faded, marking its outline like a chalk drawing at a crime scene. No one else was in the room. There was no explanation. It was a clear, unmistakable message. The thing in the house wasn't just making noise anymore. It was physical. It was strong enough to move their world around, and it wanted them to know it. That's when she called the police, and that's when Officer Noor saw the chair move. His call brought a pair of investigators, Desmond and Shaw, who documented the flying objects and the endless knocking. But they were men of science and logic. After a few weeks of recording events they could not explain, they packed their equipment and left. They had their evidence, but they had no answers, and they offered no help. The family was alone again, left behind with the thing in the walls. Desperate, Jacqueline turned to the only person who would even listen. A woman from a nearby town, a local medium who claimed she could speak to the other side. She wasn't a scientist or an official. She was just a woman with a strange reputation, and she was their last hope. The house grew quiet when the medium was there, but it was a heavy, watching silence. The activity didn't stop, it just changed. Instead of loud bangs, there were whispers that seemed to come from inside their own heads. The iron poker in the fireplace didn't fly across the room, it just slowly, silently, turned on its own to point at the medium wherever she stood. The woman was terrified, but she stayed. The worst part, the part that finally broke everyone, was when the entity found a voice. It happened during one of the medium's visits. Helen was sitting on the sofa, looking tired and pale, when her head lolled back. A voice came out of her mouth that was not her own. It was a man's voice, deep and ragged, a guttural rasp like a man who'd smoked 100 cigarettes a day for 50 years. The medium turned on a small, portable tape recorder. The voice gave a name. It called itself Bill, and it was filled with a kind of bottomless, ancient hate. It didn't threaten the family. It threatened the medium, screaming curses at her, telling her to get out of its house. To hear those words, that filthy, grown man's rage, coming from the throat of a little girl was the most obscene thing Jacqueline had ever witnessed. This thing wasn't just a ghost pushing furniture. It was a personality. It was a man, and he was furious. The whole nightmare reached its peak one night. There were no reporters, no news vans, just the family, the medium, and the neighbors who had become unwilling witnesses. People from up and down the street were drawn by the awful sounds coming from the house, the crashes, the bangs, and what sounded like a child screaming. They gathered in small, frightened groups on the pavement, staring up at the house. Through the window of her upstairs bedroom, they saw Helen. She wasn't floating. She was being thrashed about with impossible force. One second she was on her bed, the next she was flung against the wall, then pulled back, her limbs moving with a violent, inhuman speed that a child simply should not possess. The movements were so fast and strange, it was hard for those watching to even process what they were seeing. To her parents, it looked as if she was barely touching any surface at all, just a blur of violent motion in the middle of the room. There were gasps from the small crowd, people pointing, a woman crying. Dozens of neighbors who had known this family for years stood on the pavement and watched a child move with a power that simply wasn't human. Of course, the doubters still whispered. Someone claimed the family was faking it, a hoax for attention. But they couldn't explain the signed police report from Officer Noor. They couldn't explain the audio tape of that horrible, gravelly voice coming from a 10-year-old girl. And they couldn't explain the sworn testimonies of all those neighbors who stood on the street that night and saw what they saw. Then, just as suddenly and unexplainably as it all began, it started to fade. The knocks grew faint, then stopped. The objects stayed where they were. The voice of Bill was never heard again. After 2 years of constant, relentless terror, the house fell silent. The siege was over. But for Jacqueline and her kids, it was never really over. They had lived with something that had no name and no face, but had all the power. The evidence is still out there. The reports, the photos, the audio recordings. And the little house is still standing, a quiet monument on a normal street. A permanent reminder that some monsters don't live in stories. They live in the walls, right alongside you. A darkroom is just a darkroom, a small space that smells of old chemicals and bone-dried dust. But for Riley, this one felt wrong. It felt like a box, a trap. Under the deep red glow of the safety light, long shadows crawled up the walls. The only thing you could hear was the soft, steady slosh of water in a developing tray, a sound like a slow, tired heartbeat. He was a long way from his desk at the Boston newspaper, a world away from the noise and hustle he'd built his life around. He was back in the anomaly zone, a place he'd spent years trying to forget. He was only back to handle his sick father's affairs, but then his childhood friend Heather went missing. She was an amateur photographer, obsessed with the local legends. She went into the woods near the marsh, and the only thing that came back was her mangled 35mm camera. Riley developed the film himself. The first few shots were blurry movements in the trees, but the last one, the final frame, was perfectly clear. It showed a cattle field in the farmland district, and hovering over it was a pulsing, perfectly round orange light. An orb. Back at his father's house, Riley found an old, heavily annotated map of the area. His dad had spent decades marking strange sightings, cattle mutilations, disappearances. It was a chronicle of the impossible. When Riley showed the photo of the orb to Chief Jenkins, the man just shook his head. "Hoax photos and swamp gas," he mumbled, but his eyes told a different story. Riley spent the next few days hunched over the microfiche machine at the public library, the squeal of the spinning film filling the silence. He scrolled through decades of local news, forgotten tragedies. He saw a pattern, the disappearances, the lights, the mutilated cattle. It all seemed to peak every 20 years. The last peak was in 1965. The next one was right now. He started cross-referencing his father's map with old police reports and FAA incident logs from the 70s he found in Heather's meticulously organized files. The pattern became clearer, sharper. It was a 3-step process. First, a cattle mutilation would be found in the farmland district. Exactly 48 hours later, people would report seeing a tall shadow in the woods around the main settlement. And a day after that, the orb would be sighted over the central ridge. It always started in the same place and radiated outward from a central point on his father's map, a stone formation called the Sacrificial Slab. He talked to some of the town's old-timers. They spoke in low, weary voices. The shadow, they said, wasn't an animal. It was a hungry echo that fed on fear. The orb was something ancient, something that didn't like to be disturbed. They weren't spooked. They were resigned. This was just a part of life in the anomaly zone. A visit to the small local airport turned up another strange detail. According to the old FAA reports, the unidentified crafts, seen over the marsh, never left the 200-square-mile boundary of the anomaly zone. They were always contained. This thing wasn't just passing through. It lived here. Driven by a growing dread, Riley drove his truck out to the central ridge, to the spot marked as the sacrificial slab. It was just a weird, moss-covered pile of stones. He pushed his way through some thick, thorny brush, and then he saw it. A massive, perfect circle pressed into the swampy ground, filled with dark, still water. It looked like a giant fingerprint, and all around its edge grew a strange, non-native orange moss, the exact color of the light in Heather's picture. That night, the pattern began again. A farmer on the edge of the farmland district found one of his cows dead. The cuts were impossibly precise, the body drained of blood. Riley got there just as Jenkins did. In the flashing red and blue lights of the police truck, the chief's face was pale and slick with sweat. The act was finally gone. "The state police call them the black helicopters," Jenkins said, his voice barely a whisper. "But they ain't got squat on what takes the cattle." It's been happening since I was a kid. The clock had been reset. Riley knew he had 48 hours. He followed the timeline. The next night he took his own 35mm camera and went into the main settlement forest. The air was dead still. He heard a twig snap behind him and turned. Between the trees, a figure moved. It was horrifyingly thin and tall, a distorted humanoid shape with grayish skin. The shadow. It didn't make a sound as it moved, but then it spoke. It used Heather's voice, a scratchy, distorted recording of her last words. "What? No. Stop. Help." Riley scrambled backward, his heart pounding against his ribs. It was a defense mechanism, a thing that mirrored the fear of its victims. He didn't even raise his camera. He just ran. The final point on the map had arrived, the central ridge. He went back to the sacrificial slab, his dad's map clutched in his hand. He understood now. The stones weren't for sacrifice. They were ancient markers, a warning left by people who knew what lived in the swamp. At the water-filled depression, the air grew thick. A massive, silent, orange orb materialized over the center of the circle, distorting the very air around it. And at the center of the mossy circle, he saw her, Heather. She was alive but gone. She sat cross-legged in the mud, staring blankly at the orb, completely catatonic. As Riley moved toward her, a wave of pure dread washed over him, so intense it almost buckled his knees. It was coming from the orb. It wasn't a thought or a vision, just a raw, crushing feeling of absolute terror. He looked at Heather's face, her eyes wide with a silent scream that seemed bottomless. He knew he had to get her out of there. The orb just hovered, silent and observant. It stayed there for a few more seconds, a perfect, impossible sphere of light hanging in the night. And then it simply vanished. It didn't fly away. It was just there 1 second and gone the next. He heard the wail of sirens growing closer. He scrambled through the mud, grabbed Heather, and started pulling her back toward the tree line. Moments later, Chief Jenkins and 2 other officers burst through the trees. They saw Riley standing over the strange, circular depression in the swamp, Heather muttering beside him. But they were too late. The orb was gone. They escaped, but Heather was broken, her mind shattered by whatever she had witnessed. The official police report called the event a swamp gas fire and a low-flying weather balloon incident. Riley's editor in Boston killed his story for lacking credible sources. He left the anomaly zone and never looked back. But months later, driving past on the highway, He saw a newly fenced-off field on the edge of the farmland district. A new herd of cattle was grazing peacefully. At the edge of the field, a small, perfectly round patch of non-native orange moss had started to grow. The anomaly hadn't been defeated. It had just reset its borders. FAA advised. Lights reported over the Central Ridge Marsh, routine. Filed October 5, 1885, 12 a.m., logged as weather-related. During tornado season, back in '71, the sky over a small town in the northwestern part of Arkansas often looked like a bruise. It was the kind of deep purple and gray that settles in before a bad storm, and a tense quiet fell over the fields. In a town that small, just one main street and a handful of houses, you felt things collectively. And everyone felt that the world was waiting for something to break. It began with a man named Mr. Bryan. His wife Martha had passed a few months prior, and in a town where everyone knew your business, his grief was a public spectacle he endured quietly. He'd spend most evenings on his porch, watching the day end. That evening, as the sun bled out behind the clouds, he saw something that didn't belong. Perched on the very top of his old rusted grain silo was a shape. It was tall and unnaturally thin, a stark black cutout against that ugly sky. A flicker of heat lightning flashed, and in that split second the shape took on a horrifying clarity. It had what looked like massive, ragged wings folded tight around a skeletal frame, and it had eyes, two small points of glowing, sickly yellow that stared right at him. They didn't blink, they just watched. He drove into town the next morning to tell Sheriff Moore. He'd known Moore since they were boys, which made the conversation that much harder. The sheriff's office was a cramped space, ruled by the buzz of a dying fluorescent light. When Mr. Bryan, a man known his whole life for being steady, started talking about a winged creature, the sheriff just listened with a tired patience. He'd seen what grief and isolation could do. He gave his old acquaintance a weary look, told him to try and get some sleep, and filed the report away. But in a town that small, a story doesn't need an official report to get around. The whispers started where they always did, in the worn-out booths of the town's only diner. A few days later, a farmer from the edge of the county called the sheriff, his voice shaking, swearing he'd seen something impossibly large glide between his pecan trees. Then, a woman who lived down a long gravel road woke her husband in a panic, claiming something had been perched on their roof. The gossip solidified into a name, the Bird Woman. Dr. Thompson, the town's young pragmatic doctor, saw the results in her clinic. More people started showing up, complaining of insomnia and a creeping anxiety they couldn't shake. These were people she'd known her whole life. She blamed it on the oppressive pressure of tornado season, a shared communal stress. She prescribed mild sedatives and told them to keep their windows shut. While the adults worried, a restless 17-year-old named Brown saw a legend in the making. In a town where nothing ever happened, the Bird Woman was a thrill. He and his friends started spending their nights driving the back roads, flashlights cutting through the darkness, hoping for a glimpse. It was their investigation that turned up the first piece of physical evidence. Near the muddy banks of a creek, they found them. Footprints. Huge three-toed tracks pressed deep into the earth, unlike anything from a textbook or a hunting guide. The boys stood in a circle, their flashlight beams converging on the strange depressions in the mud, a sudden chill cutting through the humid night air. This was real. The simmering fear boiled over when the promised storm finally hit. It wasn't just a storm. It was a monster, a supercell that turned the afternoon sky a sickly greenish black. The wind didn't just blow, it screamed. The first thing to go was the power. A series of loud pops echoed across the valley as transformers blew, plunging the isolated town into a sudden, shocking blackness. Then came the deluge. The rain turned the single highway leading out of town into an impassable river. The town was officially cut off. Sheriff Moore was trapped in his office, the phone lines dead, his radio spitting nothing but static. He was the only law for 30 miles, and he was completely helpless. In that suffocating darkness, broken only by the strobing flashes of lightning, the sightings multiplied. The creature's glowing yellow eyes became the only landmarks in the chaos. A woman saw them peering into her kitchen. A man saw the winged shape crouched on his fence post for a terrifying second. People huddled in their homes, listening to the freight train roar of the wind. They knew, with a certainty that went deeper than logic, that something was out there with them. Dr. Thompson, working by the weak flicker of an emergency lantern, found herself trying to calm her neighbors, her friends. But the doctor's own hands were shaking. Her scientific certainty was a flimsy shield against the fear now gripping her own heart. Brown, fueled by a reckless mix of adrenaline and stupidity, decided he was going to force a confrontation. He dragged his father's old generator into an open field and aimed a single, powerful spotlight at the abandoned grain silo where it all began. He stood there, soaked to the bone, his heart pounding. The spotlight cut a perfect white circle in the churning blackness, and then, without warning, the generator gave a final wheezing cough and died. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the noise. In that instant, Brown felt it. A cold, heavy presence directly behind him. He didn't see it, but he heard it. A thick, powerful, leathery thwack and then a scrape, like giant wings fighting the updraft, just inches above his head. He screamed, a raw animal sound that the storm immediately swallowed, and he ran, not looking back until he slammed and bolted his front door behind him. The creature made one last appearance that night. It came to Mr. Bryan's bedroom window. The old glass was rattling violently in its frame, but Mr. Bryan was looking at the two glowing yellow eyes on the other side. They just stared at him. And in that silent, unblinking gaze, he saw a terrible, ancient acceptance. He understood the creature wasn't there to kill him. It was just a witness. It had come to watch the town's spirit break. Mr. Bryan, a man who had already lost everything that mattered, felt no fear. He simply stared back until the bird woman silently turned and dissolved into the downpour. When the sun finally rose, the storm was over. The sky was a pale, exhausted-looking blue. The highway was a wreck, but the world was connected again, and the bird woman was gone. But the fear it had brought remained, a permanent stain on the small town's soul. No one spoke of it directly, but it was there. Sheriff Moore started keeping whiskey in his desk drawer again. Dr. Thompson began filling a private journal with notes on things she couldn't explain. And Mr. Bryan lived out his days with a quiet, chilling knowledge, knowing that in a town that small, some secrets are kept by everyone, and that every time the sky turned that particular ugly shade of purple, the silent watcher might be returning. A man's world is what he builds with his own two hands. For Donald, that world was a small farm in southwest North Carolina. It was a place that made sense. You put seed in the ground, you got crops, you raised animals, you got meat and milk. After seeing enough of the wider world during the war, he was content with the simple logic of his own few acres. The sweat on his brow meant food on his table, and a hard day's work meant a solid night's sleep. That was the deal he'd made with the land. And the land had always kept its end of the bargain, until it didn't. One morning, the air had a bite to it, the kind that turned a man's breath to white smoke. Donald pulled on his boots, the leather stiff from the chill. and walked out toward his rabbit pens. The crunch of his boots on the frozen dirt was the only sound. That's what hit him first. An absolute heavy silence. No gentle chewing, no scratching of hay, no soft snuffling from the hutches. He pulled open the first latch, a knot of unease tightening in his gut. Inside, a dozen of his best rabbits lay perfectly still. Their fur was clean, their bodies were neat. There wasn't a mark on them, except for 2 tiny, precise punctures on each of their necks. And there wasn't a single drop of blood to be seen. Not on the fur, not on the hay, not anywhere. He told himself it had to be a sickness, some strange disease the county agent had never mentioned. But he knew better. A feeling, cold and sharp, told him something had come visiting in the night. He drove his truck into town and went straight to see Chief Kinlaw. The chief was a man who liked his town quiet and his paperwork tidy. He dealt in facts he could write down on a line, not in feelings. He listened, his face giving nothing away, as Donald explained the state of his rabbits. Kinlaw leaned back in his squeaking chair and shook his head. Probably a fox, Don. Or a weasel. He picked up a pen, and on the official report, the scratching of the nib on paper filled the quiet room as he wrote the word vandalism. He told Donald to build a better fence, to lock things up tighter. The chief was protecting the town's reputation, keeping the peace, but Donald knew what he saw, and it wasn't the work of any fox. He left the station feeling like he'd been dismissed, the unsettling truth of his empty pens, a secret only he seemed to understand. A few days passed, but the quiet wrongness didn't go away. It started to spread, like a sickness in the air itself. The calls started coming in from other farms on the edge of town. A chicken coop raided, its occupants gone without a feather out of place. A few sheep found lying in a field, untouched but for those same 2 little marks. The stories were all identical. No sign of a struggle, no sounds heard in the night, and no blood. Just gone. The talk started in whispers at the general store, then in hushed conversations over backyard fences. People started locking their doors a little earlier, listening a little harder to the sounds the night made. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves in the woods now carried a new weight. It was the sound of something unknown, listening back. Donald's deepest fear was for his goats. They were his livelihood. One night, the familiar sound of their bleating in the pen was the last thing he heard before falling into a heavy sleep. He woke up before dawn to that same awful silence he remembered from the rabbit pens. He didn't even bother with his boots, just ran out into the freezing air, the sharp stones on the path digging into his bare feet. He threw open the gate to the enclosure. They were all there, every last one of them, lying still in the dirt. Their eyes were open, glassy. They were cold, and they were empty. It wasn't a slaughter. A slaughter is messy, violent. This was something else entirely. It felt like a violation, like the rules of nature had been broken right there on his land. Donald stood there, looking at years of his life's work just erased. He sank to his knees in the dirt, a sound tearing out of his throat that was half a sob and half a scream. He yelled out into the darkness at whatever was listening. He yelled that the killer was low and black as polished stone, a thing a shotgun couldn't touch. The goats finally made it impossible for Chief Kinlaw to look away. This was too big, too strange. He couldn't write this off as a fox. He made a call, and a state veterinarian drove out, a man who dealt in the cold, hard language of biology. The vet worked quietly, his face grim. He didn't say much, but his report spoke volumes. The words were clinical, clean. Complete systemic exsanguination. The blood hadn't been spilled. It had been removed, taken, with a precision that was almost surgical. Kinlaw stared at the typed words. It was a report describing an impossibility, a monster that hunted his town. His simple, understandable world was cracking apart at the seams. Right then, a car with city plates rolled into town. A reporter named Vera got out. She had a sharp look in her eye and a notebook ready. She was a professional skeptic, sent to write a story about small-town panic. To her, Donald was just a hysterical farmer, and Kinlaw was a hick cop out of his depth. But the chief, desperate and needing someone else to see what he was seeing, didn't argue. He just handed her the vet's report. Vera read it, her confident smirk slowly fading. She read the technical terms, saw the diagrams of the clean, tiny wounds. Her face went pale. This wasn't a story about hysteria. It was a story about a documented, terrifying anomaly. In that moment, she stopped being a reporter looking for a story and became a witness to an impossible truth. The town had had enough. The fear was a poison, and they decided they had to get it out. They organized a hunt, a massive sweep of the swamps and woods in that part of southwest North Carolina. The air filled with the sharp smell of gun oil and damp earth as dozens of men, their faces set and grim, moved into the trees. Donald was with them, his grief now hardened into a cold, hard rage. They moved for hours, the only sounds the sloshing of their boots in the mud and the calls of night birds. Then a sharp crack echoed from the tree line, the sound of something heavy snapping a dry branch. A low black shadow darted between the thick trunks of the cypress trees. It was just a blur, impossibly fast. A nervous shout, then another, and then the night exploded with the roar of shotguns. Orange flashes lit up the trees, but the pellets just tore through leaves and bark. Men were firing at shadows, at the sounds of each other moving through the brush. When the shooting stopped and the ringing in their ears faded, there was nothing. The thing was gone. It had played with them, showing them it was faster, smarter. They weren't hunting an animal. They were chasing a ghost that could bleed you dry. The beast made one last kill, a prize hog, right on the edge of town, as if to prove it could come and go as it pleased. And then, as quickly as it had arrived, it was gone. The attack stopped. The silence returned, but it was a different kind now, a heavy, listening silence. Donald never rebuilt his farm. He became a quiet man who sat for hours in the general store, his eyes fixed on nothing, a man who had seen too much. Vera wrote her story. It wasn't the one her editor wanted. She called it Unidentified Predator Syndrome, a chillingly rational account of the impossible. It cost her a promotion, but she told the truth. Her article is what launched the legend out into the wider world. And Chief Kinlaw, a man who once believed only in what he could see and file, kept the folder. He locked the vet's report and the witness statements away in a heavy drawer. On the tab, he wrote in black ink, SW North Carolina, 1954 unsolved. The file sits there still, a testament to a few weeks when something that didn't follow the rules of God or nature came to town and left nothing behind but fear, and a story that will never really be over. West Alabama heat hangs in the air, the kind of thick, heavy summer that feels like a wet blanket on your skin. For a young couple from up north like John and Sarah Miller, it was a whole different world. Back home, life had been a constant rush of traffic, deadlines, and noise. Down here, the only thing that rushed was the creek after a good rain. They'd bought a small cabin, tucked right up against the edge of the Blackwood Creek swamp, and for the first couple of months, it was everything they'd dreamed of. It was a real quiet spot, a little slice of heaven. Their days fell into a simple, peaceful rhythm. John had found work with a local construction crew, coming home each evening tired, sunburnt, and satisfied. Sarah spent her time tending to a small garden she'd planted, coaxing tomatoes and cucumbers out of the rich, dark soil. Their evenings were the best part. They'd sit out on the porch swing, the wood creaking softly, and just listen. The swamp had its own song, a chorus of crickets and the deep booming croak of bullfrogs. They learned to tell the difference between the splash of a big-mouthed bass hitting the water and the gentle plop of a turtle sliding off a log into the creek. It was a kind of peace they'd never known before, a feeling that they had finally found the one quiet corner of the world that was meant for them. The transition from peace to something else entirely didn't happen overnight. It was gradual, a series of small, strange moments that were easy to dismiss on their own. It might have started with the knocking. Some nights, after the chorus of frogs had settled into a steady rhythm, another sound would join in. It was a low, wooden knocking coming from deep within the trees. It wasn't the rapid drumming of a woodpecker. This was slower, more deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. Then a long silence before it would start up again from a different spot. They'd commented on it once or twice, guessing it was a hollow branch falling or some kind of bird they weren't used to yet. But the sound had an odd, questioning quality to it, a feeling of intelligence that was hard to shake. A week or so after they first noticed the knocking, Sarah was washing dishes late one afternoon. She was looking out the kitchen window, watching the long shadows of the evening stretch across the yard. Her eyes caught a flicker of movement at the edge of the woods. She saw a tall, dark shape that seemed to step smoothly behind a thick cypress tree. She paused, her hands still in the soapy water, expecting to see a deer step out into the clearing. But nothing did. The woods just stood there, silent and still, growing darker as the sun went down. She told herself it was just her eyes playing tricks on her, that the fading light could make a man out of a simple stump. Still, she found herself pulling the curtains closed a little earlier than usual that night. John had his own encounter not long after. He was clearing some thick brush near the property line, getting ready to extend Sarah's garden. His shovel hit a patch of soft mud near the creek bed, and when he pulled it away, he saw a track. It was a single deep impression, and it was strange. It had 3 long, thick toes, but it was bigger than any bird track he'd ever seen, and pressed way too deep into the earth for a bird. He crouched down and stared at it for a long moment, a flicker of genuine unease passing through him. He thought about a gator, but the shape wasn't right. It looked more like a giant footprint from a history museum. He stood up, looked around at the silent wall of trees, and then kicked dirt over the track until it was gone. There was no sense in worrying Sarah over something so strange. It was probably nothing. But the feeling that it wasn't nothing kept growing. The slow, methodical erosion of their peace continued. Then came the night they could no longer make any excuses for it. It was late August, the air hot and so still it felt like the world was holding its breath. John and Sarah were sound asleep when a noise from the swamp ripped through the quiet of their bedroom. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a person. It was a shriek. A raw, deep-throated sound that clawed its way out of the darkness and seemed to scrape itself right against the cabin's thin wooden walls. There was a challenge in that sound, a clear and ugly message that said, "You don't belong here." John shot up in bed, his face pale in the light of a small bedside lamp. The only other sound was his own heart, hammering against his ribs. Sarah didn't move an inch, just pulled the blankets up to her chin, her eyes wide open and fixed on the dark window. The shriek faded out, and a terrible, heavy silence moved in to take its place. They knew then. The peace was over for good. That night was the beginning of the end. The overt aggression of the shriek was replaced by something worse, a kind of long, slow psychological torment. The feeling of being watched became a constant presence. A few times, John would step onto the porch late at night and see two red points of light, like hot coals from a dying fire, glowing in the darkness. He'd blink, and they'd be gone. Their cabin, their safe haven, started to feel more like a trap. Sarah stopped going outside after dark altogether. John got into the ritual of checking the locks on the doors and windows every single night, and then checking them again an hour later. Their lives got smaller. They grew quiet, their conversations becoming short and practical. The easy comfort they once shared was gone, replaced by a shared, silent fear that sat between them like a third person in the room. They tried to tell some folks in town, but the neighbors would just nod with a nervous smile. That part of Alabama had a long history of stories about swamp monsters. John and Sarah had laughed them off as local folklore when they first moved in. They weren't laughing anymore. Even the local sheriff, a big man with a kind face, just listened patiently and told them that animals can get territorial. He didn't know. He hadn't felt the air get heavy and still the way it did whenever the thing got close. John and Sarah felt completely and utterly alone. The breaking point finally came on a wild, stormy night in October. Rain hammered the tin roof and beat against the windows. The wind howled through the trees. John and Sarah were in bed when a new sound cut through the noise of the storm and jolted them both wide awake. It was a low, ragged breathing, and it was coming from their front porch. It wasn't the sound of an animal in distress. It was the steady, powerful breathing of something that knew they were inside and was in no hurry. John slid out of bed and grabbed his rifle. He crept into the dark hallway. A deep, wet scratching noise echoed from the porch, the unmistakable sound of heavy claws digging into wood. The breathing got louder, closer to the front door. Then came a sickening screech of metal, followed by the sound of something ripping apart. The screen door was being torn right off its frame. A sudden, chilling silence fell, broken only by the pounding of the rain. Then, right outside the living room window, a deep, raspy breath fogged up a patch on the glass. Even through the wall, John could smell it. A foul, sour, sulfurous stench. A rotten stink like something had died in a sewer. That was it. He lifted the rifle, aimed at the dark, hulking shape against the window, and fired. The crack of the gun was like lightning inside the small cabin. There was no scream, just a deep, rumbling grunt of pure frustration. Then came the sound of heavy footsteps, crashing through the brush and splashing through mud as the thing retreated back into the blackness of the swamp. After that, there was only the sound of the rain. The next morning, the proof was all over their yard. The screen door lay on the porch, twisted into a pretzel of torn metal and shredded mesh. At the edge of the swamp, pressed deep into the soft mud, were massive three-toed footprints. The sheriff came again, this time with 2 deputies. They filed official police reports and made plaster casts of the prints. The whole time, the sheriff just kept shaking his head, looking from the ripped-off door to the dark, quiet tree line. He didn't have to say anything. They could see it on his face. He knew. The Millers packed up and left not long after that. They sold the cabin for a loss and didn't look back. They didn't care about the money. They just wanted to get away from the memory of those 2 red eyes and from the sour smell of a monster on the wind. The story of what happened to them spread slowly, becoming a local legend, a warning whispered from one family to the next. They started calling it the Blackwood Creeper. And to this day, down in that part of the low country, people will still tell you to stay out of the woods after dark and to listen for the sound of a heavy, ragged breath coming from deep within the swamp. Most folks go through their whole lives and never see a thing that they can't explain. They live in a world that makes sense, where the rules stay the same day in and day out. But every now and then, for a handful of people, the world decides to show its other side. For one night, the rules get tossed out the window, and they're left with a memory that they can't ever shake. It's a story they can tell, but nobody will ever really understand, because you can't understand a thing like that unless you've lived it. This is one of those stories. It happened in the Missouri Ozarks back in August of '62, a few miles outside a town so small it was really just a wide spot in the road. The heat that summer was the kind that got into everything. It made the simple act of breathing feel like a chore, and it pressed down on the world until all the usual night sounds just gave up. Inside the Pruitt family farmhouse, 11 people were trying to wait out the stillness. There was Earl and his wife Mildred, their kids, a few other relatives, and a neighbor boy named Bobby Joe. The house was quiet except for the low murmur of conversation and the gentle sound of a single light bulb pushing back against the dark. Outside there was nothing, just the thick, heavy silence of a night where you're a long way from your nearest neighbor. Bobby Joe, being a kid, couldn't sit still for long. He told the others he was stepping out for a minute and pushed open the screen door, which slapped shut behind him with a familiar sound. He stood on the porch, looking out at the dark line of trees, and that's when he saw something that didn't belong. It was a silver object, perfectly shaped, that seemed to give off its own soft light. It made no noise as it fell from the sky, dropping silently behind the trees and into a ravine a good ways from the house. It wasn't a plane, and it wasn't a shooting star. It was just wrong. He went back inside, trying to tell the adults what he'd seen, but they just figured the heat was getting to him, making him see things. He sat back down at the table, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. He listened. That's when he noticed it. The usual night-long racket from the crickets and cicadas was gone. Everything outside had gone completely quiet. It wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was an empty quiet, like the world was waiting. He was about to say something when a face appeared at the kitchen window. It was small, maybe 3 or 4 feet tall if it were standing. Its eyes were huge and a bright, deep purple, and they seemed to give off a super dark, low glow. The thing had its face pressed right up against the glass, looking in. Its arms, long and thin like sticks, were visible on either side of its head. For a second, nobody in the house moved. They just stared, a deck of cards frozen in Earl's hand. Then someone let out a choked gasp from the other room. Another face, just like the first, was at the living room window. Then a third appeared at the end of the hall. They were all around the house, just watching them. That's what broke the spell. Earl dropped the cards. His eyes shot to the gun rack on the wall, but the rifle wasn't there. A cold knot formed in his stomach. He frantically looked around the room, but it was nowhere to be seen. With no time to search the house, his eyes landed on the old broom leaning in the corner. He grabbed it, the worn wooden handle feeling flimsy in his hands. He saw that the kitchen window was cracked open an inch. He began to walk slowly across the floorboards. As he got closer, the creature's head dipped down, disappearing from view. Earl crept the last few feet to the window, held his breath, gripped the broom handle like a spear, and then did a violent two-handed poke into the empty darkness just below the sill. He felt a hard jolt run up the handle and into his arms, as if he'd jabbed solid rock. A strange, high-pitched scraping sound cut through the night, and then the sound of something impossibly fast darting off into the bushes. Earl stood there, breathing hard. He didn't know what he had just touched, but it was hard, unyielding, and it didn't feel like anything from this world. The real fear began to set in, not of a wild animal, but of something utterly unknown, and the chilling realization that his one true weapon was gone. The rest of the night was a long, drawn-out nightmare. The creatures were always there, their purple eyes appearing at one window, then another. They heard the old brass doorknob on the front door rattle. Then came the scratching from the ceiling. A hand, long and spiny, punched right through the plaster, and one of the creatures reached down, grabbing a fistful of Earl's hair before he could pull away. That was the last straw. They were completely defenseless. They had to get out. Around 11 o'clock, in a mad dash, they all scrambled out of the house and piled into 2 old sedans. They sped away down the long dirt driveway, leaving the silent, watching house behind them. Earl's first thought was the police, but the station was 8 miles away. The closest neighbor, about 5 miles down the road, was the town librarian, a woman named Agnes, who kept to herself. They pulled into her long driveway, their headlights illuminating a small, tidy house. They hammered on her door until a light flicked on. Agnes opened the door, a look of sleepy confusion on her face that quickly turned to shock at the sight of 11 terrified people on her porch in the middle of the night. She saw the raw panic in their eyes and immediately said, "Good Lord, get inside." She listened to their story, her face unreadable. When Earl finished, insisting they had to call the police, Agnes held up a hand. "Earl," she said, her voice calm but firm, "you will not call the police. You know this town, you know what will happen. They will not believe you. It will become a story, a joke, and you and your family will never live it down." She paused, then looked at them all. "But I will go back with you. I will see it for myself." And so they went. The 2 family sedans followed Agnes's car back down the dark road to the farmhouse. They all went inside, the house feeling both familiar and deeply wrong. They gathered in the kitchen, waiting. For over an hour, nothing happened. The silence was almost as bad as the earlier chaos. A quiet shame began to creep into the room. Maybe it was over. Maybe they had dragged this poor woman out of bed for nothing. Then Agnes, who was standing by the window that looked out over the back field, spoke one word. "There!" Everyone rushed to the window. In the far distance, at the edge of the woods, stood a single figure, and then another one appeared beside it, and another. One by one, the field began to populate with the creatures. They didn't move toward the house. They just stood there, a silent army of watchers. Soon the entire field was dotted with the faint, dark glow of their bright purple eyes. They just stood there for hours, perfectly still, a terrifying, silent audience. Just before the first hint of dawn, as the eastern sky began to turn a soft gray, they all disappeared. Not one by one, but all at once. The field was empty. The siege was over. The cops were never called. The Pruitt family never spoke of it to anyone else. And Agnes, the town librarian, went home. She documented the entire night's impossible events in the unofficial local librarian's log, a meticulous record of the town's real history, and stored it away on a dusty shelf in the back of the town library. A secret, waiting.